Hello and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm John Harrington, the editor of PRWeek UK, and today we're looking at agency finances off the back of a groundbreaking new project from PRWeek called the Companies House Files. We've been digging into Companies House data from the UK's 50 biggest comms agencies over the past 5 years to look at major trends in big themes from profit and headcount to wage bills, pension contributions and so on. 5 articles are live at the time of recording. Look out for more to come over the coming weeks on prweek.co.uk. To discuss some early findings and what they mean, we have my colleague Ellie Lewis, data editor at PRWeek UK, and Campaign Red, who's been writing the initial articles. Hi Ellie, how are you?
Hi, yeah, I'm good, thanks, John.
Good to see you. And I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast Esther Carder, partner at the accountancy firm Moore Kingston Smith. Hi Esther, how are you today?
Hi, John. I'm very well, thank you. And hi, Ellie. Nice to meet you.
Well, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. So let's get stuck in. I'm going to start talking about wage bills, something we've been looking at as part of this project. Ellie, what did the data tell us about the trends in agency wages and headcount over the past 5 years?
So when we looked at the books for these 50 agencies, we saw a big increase in total wage bills between 2020 and 2022, but then things started to flatten out. There was also a bit of belt tightening that started recently. So between 23 and 24, nearly 40% of agencies with available data actually cut their headcount. But what's most interesting is that despite the cuts in headcount, the wage per person hasn't really budged. So for the past 5 years straight, the average has sat around the 70 to 80k mark.
That's really interesting. Sort of Esther, in your experience, how acutely are agencies feeling the pressure on wage costs at the moment, you'd say, and how does that compare to the situation immediately after COVID?
Yeah, I mean, look, immediately after COVID, from sort of 2020 to 2022, inflation sort of skyrocketed from about 1.5% to a peak of 11.6%. I think we've probably all quickly forgotten how high it went. And obviously this quickly led and flowed right through to the wages bill. So it's a really tough time for agencies because not only were they recovering from COVID and all the challenges that brought with it, but they were also, suffering from the pressures of wage inflation as well. Then after that, we saw a gradual decline in inflation, which has eased the pressure on salaries to an extent. But at times, to be honest, wage salary inflation was still above what general inflation was. So agencies still really reeling from the effects of it. And now, of course, we've got the effects of increased employers' national insurance on top of that, sort of to add insult to injury. So in the last survey that we looked at, where we look at the ratio of fee income that agencies spend on staff costs, the ratio is 64.4%, which is the highest for PR agencies that it has ever been in the sort of the 30 years that we've looked at that ratio. And we would recommend that it is absolutely a maximum of 60%. And that was sort of the 2024 year ends we're talking about. I think the fact that the average has remained static over the 5 years is maybe a little bit of a red herring. I think that's probably more a reflection of a shift in staff mix and maybe senior people taking less pay rises, because obviously pay rises don't happen evenly throughout all the pay grades. And I think that's probably affected the average and smoothed it out rather than a reflection of static salaries, because static they certainly haven't been.
So what are you seeing are the biggest trends now with headcount? Is it as simple as agencies cutting their headcounts, or are they investing in new specialisms? What are the general trends you're seeing?
I mean, obviously, we talked about the salary pressures and they definitely haven't gone anywhere. So that coupled with sort of slowing in fee income growth, agencies are having to make redundancies, and that has been happening over the last couple of years. Really, people trying to balance the fact that sort of post-COVID double-digit fee income increases that they sort of experienced during 2021 and 2022 just haven't continued. There was a lot of optimism. It hasn't played out. So, for example, when we look at our survey in the top 40 PR agencies, they actually saw a real decline in fee income during 2023 and 2024. So obviously you need to balance the books with resource. So agencies try to keep redundancies to a minimum by balancing some of the headcount cuts with performance-related managing people out of the business, and also just simply by not replacing people where there's natural churn. And as we know, the tenure of somebody is probably on average about 3 years. So that creates actually quite a lot of natural churn. And obviously you mentioned sort of new specialisms as well. I mean, definitely agencies investing in new capabilities around social and influencer. And then, of course, we've got the whole explosion of AI across the whole of the Marcom sector as well. And obviously, that's having a massive impact on the balance and the mix of skills and staff that you need, with perhaps less traditional junior staff required, but needing to replace those with people that have got the skills to make the most of the AI tools that are available to them. So lots of change. Never stay still.
Yeah, a lot going on, definitely. No, thank you for that. We're going to move on to profits. Ellie, we've obviously looked into this issue as part of the project. What are the main findings?
So when we looked at who's actually taking home the most profit, Brunswick was leading the pack with a 5-year average of nearly £12 million. Now, a quick asterisk there, the reporting for Brunswick does include their global numbers, so that clearly helps the total a bit. But right on their heels was Freud's at over £10 million and Syneos Health at £8.4 million. On the flip side, though, a few agencies actually averaged a loss over the same period. So it really shows you how varied the financial health of these agencies can be.
Yeah, quite stark differences there. Esther, do you think agencies are getting better at growing their profits? And where are they still going wrong in some circumstances, do you think?
Yeah, look, they've had it really tough over the last 5 years. COVID, inflation, macroeconomic uncertainty, lots of different geopolitical events, explosion of AI. So I think we can be a little bit forgiving of perhaps where they're going wrong. But I mean, I think sometimes maybe focusing on growth at all costs. We all know that comms people, creative people love the thrill of the chase. They love the new business win. But are they always making sure that that's high margin, profitable work? I think they could focus on that a little bit more, and perhaps not focusing enough on their own value proposition, actually. And obviously that leads to having conversations with clients around price rather than the value of the work that they're doing for them. Some's, still got outdated pricing models. There's a lot of talk about trying to charge for outcomes and outputs rather than charging for time and materials. I think there are lots of agencies out there that are still charging in quite what's becoming increasingly an outdated pricing model, and charging for time and materials. Agencies perhaps who are using AI, which is great, but they're investing time and energy and costs into developing and the use of that AI and the training of people of how to use it, and perhaps not really recouping that from clients, maybe just passing on the efficiencies and productivity that gains them, but not really pricing it in to clients. I could go on, there are more, but maybe we'll come on to some of those later. I don't want to come across too negative, but there are lots of things that agencies and all businesses, quite frankly, could be doing better.
Yeah, well, there's obviously a lot of investment, that money needs to come from somewhere. Do you think a lot of agencies are taking kind of margin holidays at the moment, just accepting that they're not going to be getting margin for a little while they make these kind of investments? So in other words, it's sort of factored in.
That's an entirely sensible and perfectly viable strategy if that's strategically what you have consciously decided to do. And that is definitely where, if you're a private company and you're not owned by a listed group, you have more freedom to make those decisions and take margin holidays. You haven't got the impact on the earnings per share or the share price sort of hovering over you. I think that absolutely is a strategy that some agencies could take, yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, next topic is taxation. Ellie.
What gets everyone up in the morning?
Oh, yes.
We're actually seeing a bit of a U-turn in agency tax figures. So after 4 years of steady-ish growth, peaking at an average of 914k in 2024, the numbers took a bit of a dive. So that figure dropped 45% in 2025 to just over £500,000. Now, while that seems pretty daunting, not all the agencies have actually filed their 2025 numbers yet, so that drop might look a bit less dramatic once the full picture's in. However, even with the lag, the direction of travel is definitely pointing towards a bit of a cooling off period.
Interesting. Esther, what's your take on this? Is this simply a result of profits falling, or do you think agencies are doing anything particular to reduce their tax bills and being more tax efficient, I suppose?
Generally speaking, it does relate to the profits being generated, and it will correlate very strongly with that. I mean, agencies generally do have a fairly simple tax profile. Their tax affairs are not complicated. I guess if you've got agencies that are within a group, they might have management charges that maybe obscure a little bit what's going on, and that might include some overseas entities where they might be trying to shift profits around. But to be honest, that's fairly heavily governed by sort of tax rules around transfer pricing. So there's a limit to how you can manipulate that. Some agencies might be claiming valuable research and development tax reliefs if they're building their own software tools in-house. But you do have to be solving genuine technical uncertainty, not just building features, to quote HMRC for that. So there might be some wins there that are reducing tax bills. But do remember, actually, I'll just put in with the R&D tax credits, remember the rules have changed and you do need to inform HMRC of your intention to claim R&D tax credits within 6 months of the year end. And I do see some agencies missing out there where they're forgetting to let HMRC know because they're not aware of the new rules.
That's some great advice. Thank you for that. Moving on. Now, the articles about bosses' pay have unsurprisingly generated a lot of interest. Ellie, what can you tell us about that?
So, after a few years of post-COVID growth in the average top director's pay, we actually saw that nearly 50% of the UK's top agency bosses saw a pay reduction in 2024. And on the broader spectrum, we're seeing a huge range of salaries. So, while the average is sitting around that £500,000 mark, there are extremes. There's 2 industry leaders breaking the £3 million barrier, while others are taking a salary of under 100,000. So a really massive range there.
Interesting. Esther, are you surprised that remuneration of agency bosses has dipped slightly recently?
Well, I mean, look, fee income dipped during 2024 and 2025, and so did profit margin. So I guess not particularly surprised that directors would take their share of the pain and reduce their remuneration. I mean, also owners of businesses, of private businesses, can take dividends as well, whereas directors or agencies that are group owned can't. So this can distort the amount that you're seeing coming through in directors' remuneration as well. But overall, not a great surprise, and it's good that they're taking the pain.
Yeah. And the overall question of how much agency bosses get paid, obviously it can be a delicate issue to talk about and frankly to report on. Do you think agency bosses are paid too much or not enough in your view, or is it a really unfair question to ask?
Oh, couldn't possibly comment. I get myself in trouble with all sorts of my clients. I mean, if you look at it, PR is in the business of consulting, and generally speaking, most PR bosses are paid less than those at the big consulting firms. So no, I don't think they're overpaid, and that's definitely the answer that everybody listening will want. However, I do think it's important that directors and the senior leadership team as well should have quite a large performance-related element to their remuneration. So if you can run a successful and profitable agency, then you deserve to reap the rewards as long as you're paying staff fairly, albeit that probably goes hand in hand with a successful agency, because if you aren't paying people fairly, you won't be able to attract the top talent and therefore you won't be able to attract the top clients. So no, I don't think they're overpaid, but there definitely should be a performance related element to their remuneration package.
So some other questions more generally. What are the biggest 2 or 3 concerns you have at the moment about how agencies are handling their finances?
Yeah, I guess these sort of dovetail into sort of some of the things that agencies aren't quite doing right in terms of growing their profits, sort of one of the questions that you brought up earlier. But I guess one of the areas, and this really is make or break with your profit margin in terms of the amount of fee income that you're spending on staff costs. I think agencies don't always proactively manage their resource. They monitor their resource utilisation and what their staff cost ratio is. But I do think that they could proactively manage it better in terms of, not having as many people sitting on the bench, making quicker decisions to manage people out of the business if they're underperforming, maybe shuffling around projects when they're happening to better utilise their resource and, minimise the amount of sort of contractors or freelancers they get in. Not that PR agencies use huge amounts of contractors, but obviously the fewer they use, the better, because, the second that you're going over that target 60% fee income to staff cost ratio, profit margins very, very quickly erode. And the other, I think, is really having a good understanding of which of your clients are profitable and which of your clients aren't profitable, and making sure that you're not heavily reliant on a particular client that you're then terrified of losing, that you're over servicing. Just understanding what types of clients, what sectors, maybe what geographies are delivering the more profitable work. There's many agencies out there that will have the unprofitable retainer. Okay, they're safe, they're comfortable, you've got regular cash flows coming in every month, but they're not always as profitable as projects, because agencies, I don't think, are quite as robust at making sure that they renegotiate every year what those retainer fees should be, and a lot of them are overserviced.
It's really good advice. And something I kind of alluded to earlier on, but do you expect finances at agencies to look better or worse this year, or stay roughly the same overall? What's your feeling on that?
We do a little outlook survey every 6 months, and the one we did at the back end of last year actually had quite a lot of optimism around the sector. This is the marketing services sector generally, and PR tends to track that quite closely. On average, they were predicting a 14% profit margin. However, all of the same challenges we had last year and many the year before still exist. They haven't gone away. So I think, clients still want things done faster, better, cheaper. So on average, I personally think that results for 2026 are going to be very similar to 2025. I don't think they're suddenly going to get lots worse or they're suddenly going to get lots better. However, within that sort of average performance, I think there's going to be more polarization. So those sort of specialist agencies, ones perhaps in regulated industries like financial or healthcare or tech, will probably outperform, whereas those more generalist agencies are more likely to underperform. And then again, in this Outlook survey, 20% of agencies thought that profits probably would decline in 26 compared to 25. And I think it's likely that many of those 20% probably are those more generalist rather than specialist agencies.
A real kind of squeezed middle phenomenon, perhaps.
Yeah, interesting. And on the back of that, what is your top piece of advice for agencies that are struggling to balance the books in such a challenging time?
Yeah, look, it's hard to distill it all down into one piece of advice, isn't it? Because there's so many things that we could talk about. And I think, tinkering around the edges rarely moves the needle enough to get an agency from where it is to where it needs to be, if it needs to significantly improve its performance. But I think, heavily investing in really defining your value proposition and being really clear about your target market is just so important, because it makes sure that you're having conversations with clients and targets about value rather than price. And it also means you can have conversations, or you should be having conversations around charging for the outcomes and not the time and materials that's going into providing the consulting. And ultimately, if you've got your value proposition right and you're targeting the right market, you should be doing less pitching, because you're pitching to the right people. Your conversion rates will significantly improve. And that just drops straight to the bottom line, because you're just using less resource pitching for unsuccessful pitches. So ultimately, I think if your value proposition, once you've really sort of refined it and challenged it, if it tells you that your client base is not optimized, or that you're attracting the wrong prospects, then it's all about taking really brave decisions to pivot and reposition yourself. And I think even though that sounds quite scary and will inevitably result in some short-term pain, a bit of a profits holiday that you were leading to earlier, John, ultimately it could make the difference between surviving or not, and hopefully, mean that you will have long-term success.
That's really fascinating. So there's a real sense that kind of staying still is not an option. I mean, arguably it never is, but, perhaps more so now than ever, or certainly in recent times.
Absolutely, more so now than ever. Yeah, standing still is definitely not on the cards.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Thanks so much to Esther and to Ellie for your brilliant insights. Hope to see you soon. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be with you.
Brilliant. Well, I feel we've only just scratched the surface here. I strongly recommend looking at the Companies House Files articles on prweek.co.uk. Among other topics in the coming weeks, we'll be looking at trends including dividend payments, recruitment, and more on profits, margins specifically, so don't miss out. Until next time, thanks for listening and goodbye.